It gives me pleasure to introduce Professor Anne Vandenhock. She worked as a Catholic chaplain in several hospitals in Belgium and the United States. She has a doctorate in pastoral theology. She's professor of pastoral care at the famous Roman Catholic University in Leuven in Belgium. She coordinated the European Network for Healthcare Chaplaincy for 6 years after the time that Father Stavros Kokkinos did this for 10 years. She is currently chairing the new European Research Institute for Healthcare Chaplaincy. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Father Stavros, for inviting me here in the conference to speak. Finally, after all these years, I accepted your kind invitation. Together with Father Simon and together with Father Darius and Father Adamantios, it feels like we're having a small committee meeting in Rhodes, and it's very nice to be among friends. Thank you so much for your invitation. It's kind of humbling to talk about hope after having the session on war this morning. I was very touched and moved by it, and my respect goes out to all the people working in territories that are dealing with war and terrorism and violence and suffering beyond our insight and our consciousness. I think if you talk about hope, though, that there are different kinds of suffering that are linked with it. And today I would like to talk to you about the issue of hope in the context of chronic illness. I think that the number of people with chronic illness in our Western world, for sure, is increasing. We are getting older. But also there is the evolution in medicines, which makes that people will get to live with their disease and illness for a longer time. I think about mental illnesses, but also about physical illnesses like cancer, where medicines have evolved in that way that cancer becomes a chronic disease instead of an acute disease. So a lot of people have to deal with this situation. Now, how do you cope with an illness that takes 10, 20, 30 years to live with? How do you deal with that? And is there room for hope? And what is the role and the impact of hope? What does hope do? And what is hope? Well, I've worked as a chaplain for a number of years, as Father Demetrios kindly mentioned. And I saw that hope plays a major role in the life of ill people in hospitals. Even when there is no hope for a cure, even when they cannot be cured, there is still a hope. Even when they are dying, they are hoping. And I want to tell you one story particularly about a man that I knew in dialysis. He had chronic kidney failure, and he was also a heart patient, so he knew that he wouldn't live for a long time, not long enough to have a kidney transplant. And he was in his 70s, and I visited him regularly as a chaplain. He was a Catholic, and we talked about his faith and how he viewed his end of life. And we had a good relationship, and there was humor, so I could joke with him. And I jokingly said to him, well, what if, you knock on the doors of heaven and there is no God to open? What are you going to do then? And instead of jokingly answering me, he looked at me and he said very seriously, but Anne, my dear, if there is no God, if everything I believed in is not true, then I have lived with hope. And that's the greatest gift that my faith could give me. And I was astonished by this story because it touched me so deeply that someone could say that hope is the most beautiful gift that faith could give you. And I think, therefore, as a caregiver in hospitals with people who are, or in parishes, where people who are chronically ill, it is our job to discover God's face in the life and in the body of people who are chronically ill. Now, it is not easy to define hope. Fromm in the 50s already said, well, asking to describe hope is like asking a fish to describe the water he swims in. It's impossible. It belongs so much to his being, to the part of his life, that it's almost impossible. It's part of our human life. We cannot but hope. Of course, there are times that we despair, but we cannot but hope. And hope is not something that you catch and can hold and grab in your hand. It is a process. We are involved. We are pulled into the future by that thing called hope. This is a painting that I love very much, which to me reflects hope. And the artist gave it the title, even Resurrection, which is something to think about. Well, in my tradition, Thomas of Aquinas already did an attempt to define hope. And I like his definition because it brings together hope and longing, which is, I think, very important. What comes first? Does hope exist out of longing, or does longing comes together with hope? It's a philosophical question that I keep asking myself. But Thomas of Aquinas sees hope as something intrinsically good, hard to attain, but not impossible. But I love this definition too. It's from 3 clinical nurse researchers, Farron, Hertha, and Popovich, who did a lot of work in researching the link between health and hope, and the impact of hope on health, and vice versa. And they came up with this definition that I like, which says, hope is a fundamental experience of the human existence that functions as a way of thinking, feeling, and acting, and as a way for a person to connect with oneself and the world. Hope has the capacity to be flexible in expectations. If the hoped for is not attained, hope can still be present. Well, what I take from that definition is the sheer flexibility of hope. If you hope for a cure, if you hope to be healed as a chronic patient and no one can offer you a cure, your hope is able to change its perspective and to focus on something else. There is a research that looks into the hope that people have who are ill with cancer, and the one group is treated very aggressively with chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and the other one cannot be helped anymore and is treated within palliative care. And the questions on hope that they are asked are analyzed, and we see that both groups score the same amount of hope. It's just a different hope. The one hopes to be cured, the one hopes to die without pain or in peace, but hope transfers its goal all the time. And that is so strong and forceful about hope. There are more characteristics about hope that I want to touch upon. Hope has a relationship with the time. And as Father Nassif this morning kindly pointed out, people can hope because they have experience with God in the past. So what you have experienced in the past, in your faith, in your religion, in your hope, is a base for hoping today and gives meaning to your life today, but also pulls you forward in the future. What I think is remarkable for people who are chronically ill is that their future stories are heard when they get a diagnosis, and even during the time of their chronic illness, they get diagnosis after diagnosis, or verdict after verdict, or treatment after treatment, and time again their future stories are damaged and have to change. And it kind of uses a huge amount of energy to change your future stories. And the future has a specific relationship with hope. maybe a privileged relationship with hope, because hope pulls you forward in the future. Hope makes you get up out of your bed each day and get through the day and to the next day. So it has a privileged relationship with the future. Hope, therefore, is an engine. It gets us out of bed in the morning. It gives meaning to our life. It's our spiritual engine. It's the engine of our faith. And it is very relational. If people have no relational context, if they have no support from others, if their chronic illness makes them more and more isolated, hope gets damaged, but hope flourishes in a relational context. It's embedded in life. It has to do with my life. Hope is very concrete, but at the same time, hope is always transcendent. And the French, I don't usually refer to the French, I'm from Belgium, but the French have a very beautiful expression to say, quand il n'y a plus d'espoir, il reste l'espérance. And they use two words for hope, espoir, espérance. And espoir is very concrete. It's the here and now hope linked to my life. Well, if that is not present anymore, if I cannot find anything concrete to hope for in my life anymore, then there is always espérance, which transcends the concrete hope and keeps you going. Hope is very vulnerable. We people can take hope away from other people. We can destroy the hope that someone has, but we can also empower and strengthen the hope that someone else has and make it a driving force in life. Now, you can hear maybe that I'm very enthusiastic about hope. I study it, I love it, I experience it in my own life, but not everyone, thinks that way. I don't have to tell you about the story of Pandora. I'm in Greece, you all know that. But there are people who have a negative view on hope, and it has to do with the connection to suffering. There are people who says, well, you shouldn't hope because it prolongs your suffering. It makes you even hope that you get out of your suffering while you're stuck in it. So you have an extra layer of suffering on top of that. It makes you desperate. Hope is something we should get rid of. And Nietzsche, of course, was prominent in that vision, saying, in reality, hope is the worst of all evils because it prolongs man's torment. And I hear a lot of people, when I lecture about hope in my home, then a lot of people ask, but what about false hope? Why don't you talk about false hope, unrealistic hope? Well, I don't talk about false hope because I once heard a psychiatrist saying there is no such thing as false hope. There is only unshared hope. Hope that is not shared, for example, between a patient and a doctor. I once was in a team meeting where the nurse told how a patient, a young woman, who fell from a ladder while cleaning a window in her house, and she broke her back, and she had a baby. And her hope was to walk again, to hold her baby, and to be able to take care of her baby. And the nurse found that very problematic because she said, she will never walk again. Shouldn't we talk with her and, tell her that she should hope other things? And the doctor said, no. This hope to her is a driving force and strength. It is a power in her. We don't take away her power. We let her, in her own rhythm, change the perspective of her hope. And this is something sacred that we have to keep. And I agree with him. But I'm so grateful that our faith, Christianity, is, totally positive about hope. And I'm sure that you heard a lot about the theology of hope already in this conference. So I'm going to be short. The sources for theology of hope for me, of course, are in the fact that we can count on the endless love of God, which showed itself in Easter. Easter is something we cannot skip in our faith. We cannot see it as a detail. It is the cornerstone of our faith, but also of our hope that love is stronger than death and that God has the power to give and install life again and again. And Daniel Salmasi, he is a priest and a doctor in the United States. He talks about the ultimate hope, and the ultimate hope to me is very much linked to Easter. He says that everyone has to decide at a certain point in his or her life before he or she dies what his ultimate hope is. And this ultimate hope for us Christians is tied to Easter. And St. Paul, who I know visited this island, talks about the theological or divine virtues of love, faith, and hope. And in the Catholic tradition, we call hope the little sister of faith and love. But I think it's a bit unjust to do that, because I think hope is very powerful and is more than a small sister. It's a divine imprint in ourselves that we have the capacity to hope. And it's also the place where we discover God. Jürgen Moltmann was mentioned already in the conference, and he is very important to me in thinking and reflecting about hope in seine Theologie der Hoffnung, because he says that every human being has a historical identity. We are born in this time. We have to deal with the consequences of the time that we live in. But on the other side, God is already pulling us towards his kingdom. We also have an eschatological identity. And this eschatological identity is the birthplace of hope. And to me, that's very important. Also, that Moltmann describes how a human life is always going between suffering and hope, which is very beautiful to reflect upon. Now, if I look at research, then of course research has a hard time to define, measure, and objectify and observe hope. In clinical trials, if we look at healthcare, it's not so easy to tackle hope, and that's because it's also transcendent. It also surpasses the functionality that we like to put into research in healthcare. And that's limited. We can only measure so much with a hope index or other instruments that people in healthcare are developing. But what is clear from the results that we have is that hope has a link to health and influences health. There is one particular research I'm thinking of where they say that people who are physically, chronically ill are accepting and integrating their illness much better if they are hopeful. So the relationship between health and hope helps people to adapt to the situation that they are in, funnily enough, because it seems like a contradiction. If we look at mental health specifically, in my country there is a lot to do about hope, because the trend in mental health at this point is towards restoring people to live again in the society, to work again, to be surrounded in a community or integrated in a community again. And in the researches in mental health, you see that hope is a factor all the time over all therapies or in all therapies and methods to treat people. Not only in the process of treating people, but also to keep the result of treatment. And one particular research I want to quote, it's from Lysaker et al. In 2005, and they say, well, if we look at people with schizophrenia who are very well aware of their illness and have a good insight, but they are not very hopeful, then we see that they use coping strategies that are linked with avoidance patterns. But if we see people that have schizophrenia, have a good insight in their disease, but are hopeful, they use different coping strategies. They use more active coping strategies where they take their faith in their own hands and move forwards. Now, I'm talking about patients, I'm talking about research, but I also want to take a moment to talk about caring for people who are chronically ill, whether it be in hospitals or in parishes or wherever you encounter people who are chronically ill. Obviously, people will not be hopeful the whole time. And we cannot oblige people to hope and tell them, you should hope because you are born into our faith, or you believe in Christ, you should hope. Sometimes people cannot hope because suffering is taking all their energy and all the meaning in their life, and because their disease, whether mentally or physically, is prohibiting them from hoping. But then it's very important as Christian caregivers or as chaplains, whether you are a doctor or a nurse or a social assistant or a therapist or whatever, or if you are a volunteer visiting people, I think it's very important to have the attitude that says, I am a being of hope. I myself, I am hopeful as a caregiver. And I think it's fundamental that you yourself look for sources of hope inside yourself, and that you grow those sources of hope so it forms a horizon of hope when you encounter people who are chronically ill. I think it's very important to be a bearer of hope, someone carrying hope around. And I think it's very important to be a sharer of hope. But maybe, most importantly, it's a lender of hope, keeping hope for the time that someone can hope again, or letting someone lend your hope for a period of time in your life to keep continuing with the struggle. Because I think it's very important to do that, because I think that we have to start from the point of view that no one and nothing can ever be hopeless. And that's why we have to keep hope. And that diseases might not be curable, physical or mental. You can be ill for the rest of your life. But that doesn't mean that you as a person are hopeless, or that your life cannot be cured and therefore, or healed. Therefore, it's very important, I think, to keep working with that hope. I want to tell you again a story. I've been visiting as a chaplain from the first week I was working in a university hospital, a woman who was my age, and she came out of a town that I worked. So I thought that's enough reason to go and say hi to her, so I went to say hi to her. She developed a severe chronic disease, and at this day, today, she's been ill, out of job, and not working, not integrating in the society for the past 25 years. And at that time, she has seen her life deteriorating in quality. First, not being able to work. Then her partner went away from her because he couldn't deal with her chronic disease anymore. Then she lost a lot of friends who she got out of her work environment. Then she lost friends out of the hobbies that she couldn't do anymore. And finally, today, there are 4 or 5 people in her phone. And that the first one is her father, which is the only family member she has left. The second one is her professor in the university hospital. The third one am I, the chaplain who has been following her for the past 25 years. And the fourth one is the chaplain who falls in when I'm not there. And the fifth one is a volunteer. So 4 out of the 5 people are people working in the hospital. She's admitted regularly. She's one of the few patients that I know of who stayed in a hospital sometimes for a year because she has so much issues to be treated. And it tells you something about the isolation of people with chronic diseases and the little relational reasons they have to hope, and how relations themselves are a base for hope. Because if you ask her, why do you continue to live? She says, because of God and because of the people who still remained with me after these years. Of course, that puts a pressure on you as a chaplain, a volunteer, a doctor, but it's a pressure that I'm gladly carrying because it keeps her alive. So in pastoral care, I want to stress that it's important to work with hope, that you can listen for those stories, those future stories in person's life with chronic disease that are damaged. What hope did they lose? What perspectives did they lose? It's very important to be aware of suffering and to take suffering seriously and not come with hope directly. And I think it's very much, how would I express it? It's very much needed to listen to unshared hope, in a sense that the hope that the patient has, and that might be, from your point of view, unrealistic, but it's real for the patient. And listening to that unshared hope provides an opportunity for the patient to, in his or her own rhythm, change the goal of the hope or the perspective of the hope. And it's supporting building new realistic future stories after that. It's using the pastoral care relationship as a fruitful orchid to grow hope. If you think about the story of my patient, the hope she has comes out of her faith and her relationships. But those two are linked together, but the relationships are very, very important. And in mental health care, as we heard also this morning in prison, it's very important that hope comes out of groups of peers, where people in the same situations are connected with each other, communicating with each other, and get hope out of there. Find out what people's espoir is, and find out what people's espérance is. Find out what their ultimate hope is. My grandmother, and I think that's very recognizable for a lot of people, my grandmother hoped to see all her grandchildren before she died. And on her deathbed, she waited until we were all there, and then she let go, then she died. Hope has a huge impact on people's life, and that was a very concrete hope. But the ultimate hope also has a huge impact. I will maybe end with an anecdote that I was once on call in the hospital, and I had very long hair there. And I was called to an older woman who was dying, and her family was surrounded. And I went to her, and she was with her eyes closed. And I said to her, I called her first name. I said very softly, her name was Maria. Maria, Maria. And she opened her eyes and she looked at me, and her face expressed awe. And she said, Our Lady is already here. And she expected to die and hoped to see Our Lady, to whom she has been praying. And she thought it was me, which was very funny to my colleagues, of course. But it shows you what the ultimate hope of people is and how it carries them also in their last moments. Looking at hope in people's life is looking how God's Spirit is at work in people. But because I truly believe that hope is the finding place of God in our lives. And I want to end with this beautiful poem of Emily Dickinson that says, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all." Thank you.